This is the Comics Alternative, episode 278, reviews of Terminal Lance Ultimate Omnibus, Death or Glory, number 1, and Black AF, Widows and Orphans, number 1. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And this week, we're going to be looking at three quite different titles, one from the other.
Yep.
We're going to begin with Maximilian Uriarte's Terminal Lance Ultimate Omnibus. After that, we're going to look at the first issue of Rick Remender and Bengal's Death or Glory. And then we're going to wrap up with Black AF, Widows and Orphans, number 1, by Kwanzaa Afeyefo and Tim Smith. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off at the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off at the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
And really, do you need to be more impressed than 50% off?
Nope.
But, one of the ways that you can find great discounts at Discount Comic Book Service is to take advantage of the bundles that they have every single month. For instance, if you're into DC Comics, there's all kinds of DC bundles. There's Vertigo bundles, there's Young Animal bundles, there's DC Kids bundles, as well as the main DC line, and you're going to find bundles from Marvel, and all at, these great discounts, 45, 50% off. Really can't be beat to get your comics at Discount Comic Book Service. You can also find titles like the ones that we talk about, Death or Glory, Black. Those are all there at Discount Comic Book Service. So take advantage of those incredible discounts, and don't forget to pre-order your comics.
That's right, and you can't find better prices than Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. You gotta go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Yeah, that would be so great of you if you do that.
Well, Paul, we have an interesting lineup this week, but before we get into, I guess, a detailed discussion of the three texts that we're going to be really delving into, we should tell our listeners, as if many of them don't know, that the nominations for the 2018 Eisner Awards came out just several days ago.
Yeah. Always excited. It's always a big bit of news that drops this time of year when nominees are announced. And the way that I tend to find out is I'll hop on social media, and there on Twitter, you'll find creators congratulating creators and stuff like that for their nominations. And there's always a little bit of people upset about this category or that oversight. But overall, it is, as usual, an exciting list of really great works of comics that a whole lot of which have been discussed on this podcast. Derek and you and the various branches of Comics Alternative cover a whopping proportion of this list at some point in the podcast.
Yeah, I was going through the list, noticing the sheer volume of titles that we have discussed in one form or another, whether it be on a review show or a creator that we interviewed.
Yeah.
Their text that came out last year. So it's an impressive list. I think this podcast is in a pretty good position in that we highlight a good number. I venture to guess maybe about half every year, but maybe that's being a little too optimistic, but I think many more of these texts are ones that we on the Comics Alternative would cover more than about every other comics related podcast out there would.
I think that's a safe claim. I think that's a boast that we can take pride in. Really, you can take pride in, Derek, because some of it is covered in the manga show and some of it in the Euro comics. And I know that every year now, we've actually had episodes even after the nominations out where we talk, where we go through and for the three young readers categories, for instance, Gwen and I previously with Andy, we'll just actually talk about all the nominees. This year we already have talked about a number of titles on that list. So yeah, it just kind of goes to show the kind of coverage that we do here at Comics Alternative and the sort of, diligent study of the medium in its various forms here in the, centrally in the US, but all throughout the world that we try to do.
Mm-hmm. And at some point in the near future, you and I plan to devote, we're not sure yet, either part of a show to this year's nominees, the Eisner Award nominees, or maybe an entire episode. Who knows? We'll decide what we want. We've done both in the past. Kunka and I have.
That's right.
So we'll do that. Now, we don't want to go into detail about what the nominees are right now, because I do want to get to our first title for this week. But before we move on from this Eisner Award nomination news, I want to say something about one of the categories, and that is the best comics-related periodical/journalism category.
Yes.
Once again, we're not on it.
That's right. Neither we nor any comics podcast.
No. Right. And, this is something that maybe we can discuss in more detail when we do our either entire or partial Eisner nomination-related episode.
Yeah.
But, yes, they are. I mean, the nominees for this year, I think, are all good.
Yeah.
I have no problem with any of them.
Yes.
These, though, for the most part, are more traditional media, and many of these have been publications that are nominated multiple times, over and over again, many times over the year. And, I have to say that not this year, but the 3 previous years, I actually nominated the Comics Alternative for this category. Nothing happened. Yeah. And I just gave up because I heard a little bit from the inside, let's say, that at least one individual who is associated with the Eisner Awards is adamantly, I guess, maybe, is that the right word, against the nomination of podcasts as a form of journalism and opinion, which, it's unfortunate, but oh boy.
We truck on.
we truck on. We move on from what, but hey, the other categories, I think, really exciting stuff to discuss.
Yeah. And Derek, I've said to you in years past, and I say this, I hope listeners can appreciate that. I essentially am a listener of the Comics Alternative, a fan, and that's sort of how you and I met. And so as a fan, I was disappointed that there wasn't a wider appreciation and acknowledgement of the work that you and Andy have done here. And podcasts in general, in terms of the kinds of, as you said, both, coverage, journalism, and opinion and criticism that happens on podcasts. Your work is so significant, and, definitely no shade at those who are on this list. I mean, the Two Morrows work is, of course, amazing. Hogan's Alley and Comics Journal, undeniable. New nominee, Panel by Panel, by Hassan Atzman El Hau, is something that I've been a fan and supporter of. In fact, I have a piece in one of the issues this past year. And so I don't think you and I mean to say that anything bad about those who are on the list in that category. But when I compare the work that you do, the work that this podcast does in covering comics, it is sad. So I don't know if any listeners out there have any sway, if you can, lend your weight to, putting some encouragement, if not to the Eisners, but just to other places where I think comics work is being recognized. Throw in a good word for us, would you?
Well, yeah, and it's not just this podcast. I think all podcasts should be considered, or other podcasts, let's say.
That's right.
Not every comics-related podcast, I think, may be worthy of nomination. And who knows, maybe we aren't. But I do think podcasting as a medium is something that should be considered. And it's really sad because about not even 10 years ago, blogging was what podcasting is now in terms of the freshness and the newness of what people were doing. Maybe not just 10 years, maybe 15, something like that. But when blogging was new, people were going, what is this? Is this kind of
legit
journalism? Yeah, is it legit?
Yeah.
You know, it raises a lot of questions, which I can understand.
Yeah.
But, podcasting has been around for quite a long time when you think about it.
Yeah, we're real. We're here to stay. I'm with you, Derek. Well, it definitely, we'll talk about the Eisners coming up. And we do thank those of you. I think, awards aside, we're most gratified by the listenership and interaction support that all of you who listen have given us. So thanks for that.
That means so much more. Thank you. Okay, let's start with the first text that we're going to be discussing this week, and that is Terminal Lance Ultimate Omnibus. Actually, I guess the official title is Terminal Lance Ultimate Omnibus, the world's most popular military comic strip.
That's right.
Yes, and this is by Maximilian Uriarte, and I'm probably mispronouncing that name. It's spelled Uriarte, Uriarte. Mm-hmm. It's by Little Brown and Company, and this came out on April 24th.
Yeah.
And we want to thank the good people at Little Brown and Company for sending us copies, because they actually reached out to us to see if we were interested in interviewing Uriarte, but we have such a congested interview schedule right now. There's really no time to do that. So we thought we would discuss this for the show. And this is a rather hefty tome. It's a hardback volume, and it clocks in at about 340 pages.
Yeah, it's a lot of comics.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Paul, but as I was reading this, my arms, my forearms especially, were getting tired, and my wrists.
It makes you appreciate that this work, which has been going since 2010, I think because it began as a webcomic, it's easy to think of it as something passing. But when you print it all out, including the blog posts, including the publication history of this whole thing, it is hefty. And I think it's meant to make you feel how much work has been put into this thing, even though it's existed in that more ephemeral webcomic kind of status, right?
Now, I'm glad that you mentioned the word webcomic, because that allows us an in to describe what this actually is.
Yeah.
Because, the primary title, Terminal Lance Ultimate Omnibus, suggests that there is a strip or a comic something called Terminal Lance out there, that this text that we're reviewing right now is the ultimate omnibus. But my guess is that the vast, vast majority of our listeners hadn't even heard of this before.
Yeah, I hadn't.
And I hadn't either. And in fact, I haven't talked lately with Sean for various reasons, and which Sean and I will get into our next webcomics episode. And I should ask him, though, the next time we talk, if he had heard of this webcomic before. But yes, this began as maybe not only, but I think primarily a webcomic. And in fact, it's still going on. It's still up. People can check it out by going to TerminalLance, terminallance.com. So that's terminallance, one word.com. But this is a hard copy version of most of what's out there. Not everything. Actually, the book picks up from, or it in terms of the strips that go up on almost a daily basis, maybe not quite daily. It begins with the first one in, I guess, January of 2010, and it goes up to strip number 450, which came out in December of 2016.
Right.
Yes. Now, the book is divided into 3 sections. There is a regular strips section, which takes up over half of the text, and that's primarily what Terminal Lance is.
Right.
There's also a relatively brief section devoted to holiday and special strips that Uriarte decided just to take some of those holiday strips instead of mixing them in with the others to put them on their own. Then there's a section that's devoted to strips that appeared in the publication Marie Corps Times. So the Marie Corps Times, which I'm assuming is a print publication, but I haven't checked. It probably has an online presence as well. So there's that. And so that makes up the core of this, but that still doesn't answer the question, what is Terminal Lance?
Yeah, man, I can pick up here maybe to talk about it as really it has the feeling it's a series of basically 3-panel strips in the traditional comic strip kind of thing. And one way I'd introduce it is I remember when I used to be a kid, I used to get the Reader's Digest magazine and, went straight to the jokes. I was all about the jokes. And I remember there was the laughter, the best medicine column where there'd be like, 4 or 5 jokes. And then there was a specific page that was jokes that were specifically, I don't remember what they titled it, but for folks in the services, in the military. And I remember going to that page and reading those jokes and not understanding the humor in any of them because it was an experience I was totally divorced from in my life. Nobody in my life, nobody in my family served in the military. They all had done compulsory military service in Taiwan, but that was not something they talked about, once we had immigrated and things like that. And so I realized when I was reading those jokes that it was a peek into a sort of segment of our population and people who matter to us, of course, but who I didn't interact with much. That's the feeling of what it's like to read these strips for me, because they are a series of gags, sort of like, 3-panel gags or sometimes 1-panel gags, about life in the Marine Corps, especially I think in the sort of the lower ranks of the Marine Corps. And, Uriarte himself, while he was serving in Iraq, began drawing these strips. And I think the appeal is immediately evident that they're the kind of gags that one soldier, sends out and a bunch of other soldiers relate to and pass on to each other, through social media and stuff like that. And it sort of gains steam and gains followers because there's the shared experience. There's these sort of inside jokes of the experience of soldiers. And you can imagine what kinds of experiences those are. Some of them about the dog days of being in boot camp, and other ones are, pretty crass. I'll just come right out and say it, dick jokes and things like that. But sprinkled in with a lot of, really the reality of the experience of being a soldier. And, he documents it in the strips, and then he includes blog posts that were written with the webcomic where, he goes into some explanatory detail, sometimes tongue in cheek, sometimes with a sense of humor, but sometimes with some gravity about the things that, you go through when you're a soldier.
That's right. And one of the things that you have in at least the strip section, the main strip section, occasionally, not with every strip, is the blog post or maybe a portion of the blog post that he had included on his original site. So if you do want the text that sometimes explains, sometimes glosses, sometimes elaborates on, and I guess spins off from, on all of these strips, then you can definitely go to terminallance.com and see those. But throughout the book, the one that we're discussing, some of them, not all of them, obviously, but, some of them have these, blog descriptions, which many times can be extremely helpful. Like, for instance, there's one I'm looking at. This is on page 53, and this is strip 110, Boot Camp, The Swarm. And this is a silent panel or silent strip where you have a soldier being approached by a drill sergeant. And then in the next panel, a second drill sergeant approaches from the other side, and then a drill sergeant in the last panel is coming down from above.
Right.
And of course, all of them have what Uriarte calls, the karate hands as he's talking.
Right, knife hands, right?
Yeah. Is it called knife hands or karate hands?
I think in the blog post he calls it knife hands.
Knife hands, okay.
Yeah.
Which I find funny. And so, you do get an explanation with that one, part of the text that went with the original strip on the blog, on the webcomic. And I found that useful at times because, like you, when your memories of reading the military humor section of Reader's Digest,
right.
As I was going through Terminal Lance Ultimate Omnibus, there were times, plentifully, there were times where I was lost. Now, sometimes I could get it from the context. Sometimes I could get where the humor was from the explanation if there was text that accompanied the strip.
Right.
Sometimes I could get what may have been funny about whatever it was that he was writing about. Over the course of reading these strips, right? Because after a while, you do get to see certain patterns, and you begin to realize, me never having been a part of the military like you, that's just a world that is completely foreign to me,
right?
And so, trying to find where the humor is. Sometimes you can pick up the humorous parts by reading a series of these strips and then seeing, oh, that's the way something is.
Sure.
Then there were other occasions where I was completely lost, and not only in terms of the humor.
Yeah.
And, that's understandable. At first, it was a little frustrating for me because anytime I read a text to prepare for the podcast, I would like to, whether I do or not, it's another matter, but I would like to think that I understand it as best as I can.
Right.
And if that means rereading, if that means digging around, if that means doing some extra textual research, then fine.
Yeah.
Couldn't really do that with this. And so at first it was frustrating, but after a while, what I decided to do was read it for what it is. Right. And just enjoy it as I go along, knowing that I'm not the primary audience.
Right.
And I think that's important for listeners to understand, that whether it is the, terminallance.com webcomic or this book, Terminal Lance Ultimate Omnibus, which I think is worth picking up, especially if you're interested in military humor, specifically comics that are devoted to military life, not just military humor. Because, there are some strips in here that are, I guess, represent more pathos than humor. Those aren't that frequent, but I kept having to remind myself I am not the primary audience here, so take from it what I'm able.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's kind of good to keep in mind. It is very much a kind of insider text, and I don't want to say that to make it feel exclusive, so that the curious can't enter in, as you and I I think both felt like we were not the insiders for whom this was originally created, especially the early strips, as you were saying. There's a little crudeness in the art style. It's not bad. It's just, you can see actually as the years go on how Uriarte, who goes on to study, I think, cartoon art, becomes just vastly improved as an artist and animator and stuff.
Yes.
But in the early stages, it's kind of crudish drawings, and even the first and second strip, it throws out all these military acronyms, and it's about how Cincos, who are staff non-commissioned officers, always say "cleared hot" in in situations that don't seem appropriate, but they just say that all the time. And it's like, as an outsider, you're like, I have no idea what that's about, what that appeals to. The first strip is about where nicknames come from, and it is very disorienting if you don't share the experience, which makes these jokes funny, of really being in the barracks and living this kind of life. Yet I think you can appreciate that that's what's going on. It's like any time that you are learning a different culture, a different world, a different, set of experiences. And I got to say, as somebody who has friends who have been in the Marines, or I don't know, I don't have any friends who are currently in the Marines, but, I haven't yet, but I'm so curious to give this to them and ask them how much of this reflects their experience, and not just their experience, but the sort of like the tone that you have to take, the sense of humor and irony that you have to have about your situation in order to endure what's a really sometimes terrifying life to live. And yet, you have to sort of go on every day and deal with, your officers being jerks and, try to survive in this context. So I think that if you go into it reading it expecting that, okay, this is either something I'm going to relate to because I share this experience, or I'm not going to understand it, but it's a kind of a fun way to get to know the kind of insider experience of people who served people in the Marines, then I think it's super, super beneficial and fun to kind of see the strip evolve over these years.
Right. And I'm glad that you mentioned the Marines. I can't recall if we had mentioned that Uriarte was in the Marines previously, but this is about the Marine life. Yeah, right. Yeah, so someone who's in the military and other branches could get something out of this, I think.
Sure. Right.
But I think it's specifically for and about the Marine life.
Marines. Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
And there are those occasions where the references are so obscure. The abbreviations, especially. In fact, there's one strip, I can't remember what number it is, which is about the ridiculousness of some of these abbreviations in terms of how they're used to communicate, an entire conversation. And so the joke is that it cuts out the people who are supposed to know these abbreviations,
right.
Which I appreciated. But with many of these abbreviations that I think people in the military, specifically the Marines, would already know, they would get the reference.
Right.
I was lost much of the time. Some of the stuff I even had to look up online.
Right.
On the other hand, there are some strips that are highly accessible to about anybody. And I want to share my favorite. And this is on page 119. This is Terminal Lance number 255, titled Like a Box of Chocolates. And we have two Marines, and I believe the characters are Abe and Jesus, because as the strip continues, you do get to see certain characters that keep cropping up again and again and again.
Right.
And so Abraham is talking to Jesus. He says, "So you remember that scene in Forrest Gump when Jenny sees her old house that her where her dad molested her, and she flips out and throws her shoes and shit?" And Jesus says, "Yeah." Abraham responds, "When I was on leave, I walked past my old recruiting station. It was like that." So I specifically like that strip. And so, I mean, now if someone didn't know the film Forrest Gump, then they wouldn't get it. But, who doesn't know Forrest Gump?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think if you take this, and we should probably also add that there's a lot of jokes about porn and masturbation and, like I said earlier, dick jokes, so, but if somebody really took this as the daily gag strips of a person who's in the experience, then you recognize actually the wide range of stuff. One of my favorites to, just bouncing off of what you were just talking about is one where, I think, this is Abe is, helping, I forget, is this his girlfriend? No, a friend maybe to babysit and changing a diaper. And, she says, she's changing a diaper and she says, "Thanks for helping me babysit. Can you pass me the baby wipes?" And he goes, "Sure." And then he looks and watches her apparently wiping the baby with the baby wipes, but he's got a puzzled look. And then he goes, "Oh, that's why they're called baby wipes. I've been using these things for years and I've never once cleaned a baby with them," And so then the blog post talks about how Marines will often have, packs and packs of baby wipes, which, I also do as well, even though I don't have a baby to clean anymore, because it's just so convenient to have those wipes for all kinds of purposes, from cleaning your gun to your body parts when you can't get a shower in, and it's, but it's sort of the way that, I think that strip is a little bit of the way that Marine life or military life crosses over, with, sort of the, civilian life that the rest of us are living in. Yep. And so those aspects of experience really come out in the strip as well. And I think that's super, super interesting.
I'm glad you used that one as an example because that's a strip where, as you mentioned, a blog post accompanies it. So what Uriarte does there is he explains that in the military, we use baby wipes for many, many different things.
Yeah.
Who would have thunk babies? Right. And I didn't get that joke at first until I read the context. So that did come in handy.
Yeah. And I do think there is enough explanation, again, for those of us who are outsiders to start entering into and some of this is like just the minutia of the life. And I love that about these strips, that it is about, the excessive presence of energy drinks, for instance, in the life of a soldier, or things like that. So, yeah.
And you did mention that this text or these strips, or even the online webcomic, may include some material that some listeners may not, I don't want to say may find offensive, some may, but some may not particularly like that kind of humor. And that's fine. Again, it comes back to this issue of audience.
Right.
I think people outside of the military, specifically the Marines, can appreciate Terminal Lance. However, there's much about this that is just so soaked within the world of the life of a Marine.
Yep.
That if you are of that milieu, if you have had those experiences, if you do get those references, then you'll get so much more out of this. You won't be offended. You'll get the joke.
Right.
I can see, though, readers outside of this world not only may be confused at times, like you and I have been discussing, that we were at every now and again reading this, but may take it the wrong way, I think. And I think that that's unfortunate, because one of the things that Uriarte does is he doesn't judge. And I noticed that coming through quite clearly. So it's a rarity that he will editorialize within the strips about a particular subject matter. And so reading through some of these, I was wondering at times, well, how does the author feel about this?
Right.
And more times than not, it's really difficult to determine how he does.
Right. Yeah, it is. And some of it, it's hard to separate from where it may be a comment on the way that people talk, and maybe even specifically the way that guys talk, right? When you're in that setting, or are you leveraging that humor for yourself? Which adds to that whole question of, I feel uneasy about some of these jokes, I feel offended by some of these jokes, and yet, especially I think in the blog posts where he's reflecting on it, he'll talk about the sort of the talk of gay, the sort of being that thrown around, and even the FAG word being thrown around quite often by soldiers, and things that they'll do and say with each other that are, that sound homophobic, but sort of play on a kind of homoerotic, exploitation of discomfort for humor purposes. You know what I mean? And so he, the joke is there in the strip. And then he comments on it in the blog. And it's not preachy at all in his commentary. He's just sort of like, look, this is how folks talk. This is what people say. And then he'll comment on don't ask, don't tell, and the repeal of that and things like that. So he sort of obviously lives and thinks in the world, but it makes me think of how the humor strip, the gag strip, is a certain space for a certain kind of energy and discourse to appear, and some of that is going to sound a little bit more like the locker room talk or whatever that you're going to have trouble with if you're not in that context. That's another part of, I think, a sense of insider outsider, and maybe even a sense of a group of insiders within the military. This isn't the experience or the talk of the chatter of all people in the military, but it is something that exists. And so I think for that, it's worth reading and studying and kind of thinking about as well.
Right. And with these blog posts that are in the text, the occasional ones that accompany the strips in the book,
right.
Many times there is an awareness that he's thinking about this, whatever the topic may be, that may even put him a little ill at ease but at least he interrogates it.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. He interrogates it. And sometimes the strip is too. There's a bunch of the strips, featuring a character named Angry Facebook Veteran, who's, for instance, triggered by seeing Colin Kaepernick refusing to stand for the national anthem. And so there's especially as the strip matures and evolves, there's a whole lot of, kind of, it feels like social consciousness from the perspective of somebody who's really been in the military. And I appreciate that as well. You can kind of see the seasoning over time of, Uriarte's voice and the characters themselves. And we should probably mention too, out of the strip came what Uriarte sort of put together as a graphic novel called The White Donkey. It was, I think he launched it on Kickstarter. It was funded within 12 hours. It was picked up by Little Brown, I think, who published it and became a New York Times bestseller. And that one seems like more of a cohesive narrative, features some of these same characters, Abe and Jesus, for instance, at the center of that story. I haven't read The White Donkey. Have you?
I have not.
Yeah. And actually I'm super interested in picking it up now because it's in this world, but it is more of a single coherent narrative I'm given to understand. So I really want to check that out now. Yeah.
From the sound of it, it seems that The White Donkey and its success paved the way for this book, Terminal Lance Ultimate Omnibus. Little Brown saw, hey, there's definitely a big audience for something like this. Why don't we collect, most of your strips from the website? So,
yeah. Derek, can I ask you, do you have a lot of history with like Bill Malden and his Willie and Joe comics, or even something like Beetle Bailey, other comics that have tried to capture the essence of military life?
That's a good question. Now, I'm aware of those, but it's not as if I've done much reading. Beetle Bailey as a kid, but that's about it.
Sure.
But as an adult, at least I'd like to call myself an adult, no conscientious efforts to really explore that genre.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I've lived that a lot more in film. Everything from Here to Eternity to Thin Red Line or whatever, Is that right? Thin Red Line, Thin Blue Line? But to see this in comics is really interesting. And it might sound like sacrilege to somebody who knows like Bill Malden work really well to say like this is a contemporary version of that. But I think if you're able to transport all the cultural signifiers to what, youngish people who are serving might think and talk about today, I think the parallels are there. So it's just interesting as an artifact of that as well. Mm-hmm.
Paul, you want to move on to the second text that we're going to be looking at this week?
Let's do it.
Okay, this is Death or Glory #1, written by Rick Remender with art by Bengal, coming out from Image Comics on May 2nd, so I guess as this episode goes up. And this was a big deal. Of course, almost any time Rick Remender comes out with a new title, it seems to be a big deal. But I remember that the image of Death or Glory #1 was on the cover of the previews catalog a couple months back.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And understandable, given that the art is pretty gorgeous. It's luscious.
Oh, it is. It is. Mm. And this is a hefty #1 issue. In fact, it comes in at a little over 40 pages, I guess, maybe about 40, 38, something like that.
Right.
So people definitely would get their money's worth, which is, I think, a great way to introduce readers to a title.
Yeah. Remender, if folks don't remember, is the writer who, came to Image and has been pretty much exclusively doing Image stuff for a while now, but via a bunch of, big name Marvel titles. And what is the Dark Horse book that he did for a long time? I'm blanking out. But anyway, he did a bunch of Marvel stuff and of course has done Image series like Deadly Class and Black Science.
Black Science, Low.
Yeah, Low, that's right. And Tokyo Ghost actually was another one of his. And so he has a knack for pairing up with phenomenal artists like Wes Craig and Matteo Scalera and stuff like that to do these really this book definitely has a Remender tone. And I can detail what I mean by that. And I'm sure you can add some thoughts to that too. And so I think people who like the Remender vibe are going to really enjoy this, and maybe other people as well too. Yeah. I don't know. I wonder, did you like this book? Did you like?
Yes. I really enjoyed this first issue. And, I think, I mentioned that this is a really long or unusually long first issue. Even though you have quite a number of pages, I think that the story in this first issue is relatively concise.
Yeah, it flies.
Because basically, you're introduced to what I'm assuming is going to be the premise to this series. And the main character is a young woman by the name of Glory Owen. And she is living with someone called Red, who has some serious medical issues. I think I guess he's in a coma.
Yeah.
And, but
is he a stepdad? Did I get that right? Or maybe just a friend of mother's? Something like that.
I thought it was a friend of the family. Maybe I missed something about the stepdad thing.
Okay. Yeah. It went quick if it was. I mean,
yes.
It's super subtle. Yeah. But a sort of father-like figure.
Right. Yes. Right. But he's, in a sick bed. The thing about where Glory and Red and then others in their community live, I don't want to say they live off the grid, but they live away from the grid, right? They try to do their own thing. And so one of the things that they do not own right now is health insurance. Right. And it costs to care for someone in that condition, in Red's condition. Right. And so what Glory attempts to do in this first issue is to come up with a plan in order to secure some funds. Rather exciting plan to get some money. Sure. And it leads her to where, I don't want to give anything away about what happens at the end, but it brings her to a confrontation with the law, to her ex-husband. And then we get the reveal at the very end. And I'm guessing that at least with this first narrative arc, this is what's going to be her dilemma, what we see on that last page. Yeah,
I think that's right. And yeah, we don't want to give it away because you should check this book out. I'm with you that it's an intriguing first issue.
Yeah.
Remender
basically, really that seems to be the premise in a nutshell. I mean, that brief description that I laid out.
Yeah, I
didn't go into too much detail.
Oh, no. You did perfect. I'd just add, it seems like Yuma, Arizona is the setting, right? And Arizona perfectly fitting for that sort of like, folks that live off the grid or out of the system, kind of lifestyle. And she sort of works in a garage. Red owns a garage. And so it's a big car. I mean, I think not the climactic, but the central image is a 2-page spread where she says, "It's my turn to take care of you," referring to Red. And she's sort of, stroking her hand over a muscle car that she's going to use to, accomplish her sort of crime adjacent. No, I think what she's doing is clearly criminal, but she's adjacent to actual criminals and trying to get the money to pay for Red's care for his liver cancer. Yeah. So no, but I think that's a beautiful setup. And, our words can't capture the aesthetics, which, Bengal is, an artist I know of, a French artist from, working on Batgirl and Supergirl as well. So there's a really, really nice, aesthetic to his art that I think visually this book is pretty stunning, pretty great.
Yeah, I think for me at least, the art is what drives this narrative. I mean, the story's interesting, and I think that this first issue is a great setup of what to expect. I guess we can expect in the series to come. But it's Bengal's art that really drives everything forward.
Yeah, I totally agree. Bengal has a style, if I can try to put words to the ineffable, it's actually similar a bit to Motor Crush. I don't know if you're familiar with the Babs Tar. I mean, you've reviewed it, so I mean, listeners, the Babs Tar and Fletcher.
We haven't reviewed Motor Crush.
Oh, really? No?
Yeah.
Oh, that's something we should talk about one day. I thought that you had reviewed the first issue once upon a time, but maybe I'm getting that confused. But in that there's an aesthetic that is very like sort of motorcycle cool, something like muscular, but the faces are drawn in a way that is a little more influenced by maybe anime or animation, you know?
Animation, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Where the characters can be super expressive and lively. And so, and yet there's this sort of like, cars and action that is done, really, really well too. So yeah, it's exciting. It's great visual comics.
Yes. Now, one character that we're introduced to briefly, I guess around the middle of this first issue, and I alluded to him earlier, is Glory's ex-husband, Toby. And whereas Glory seems to be on the more admirable side of life, Toby, her ex-husband, is on the other side. And he gets involved in something that kind of drives what happens at the very end. And again, we don't want to give anything away. But I'm wondering how prominent he'll become as the series develops.
Yeah. And the sort of criminal world that he's associated with, along with some corrupt cops and stuff like that, they all kind of figure into the story. And there's definitely aspects of, and seems pretty typical Remender, there's definitely aspects of Glory's family life, her past, her associations that seem like they're going to crop up and haunt her throughout all that happens here, you know? But I think and to put some specificity behind what I said earlier about the sort of Remender tone, I feel like, there's a certain misanthropy in all of his books, a certain sense that like there's a very dark world, that the world is closing in on us and there's narrowing opportunities. In fact, one of the words that kind of narrate and accompany when we first meet Glory is, he says, the road used to be wide and open with infinite possibilities, but it's become narrow, disappearing. We were made to run in open spaces, to drink from creeks, to sleep under stars. So, I mean, that actually reminds me a lot of the feeling of a book like Low or a book like Tokyo Ghost, where it just feels like, the future is foreclosing on us. And then his heroes are often these characters who, like, kind of born right out of a John Hughes movie from the 80s, who kind of strike out on their own, in their own road. They're kind of punk. They're kind of independent, in the middle of this world that's careening toward self-destruction or whatever. And I think that's very much a Remender note. And you get that too here. So it is a dark and sordid world, even as there are loving characters around her that Glory is living in. And I think it's very much how she's going to make her way through that. Take care of Red, take care of herself.
Yeah, this is a series I'd like to keep up with.
Yeah, I'm going to too, if only for the art. But, Remender is also reliably a great storyteller. So
definitely. Okay, the final title that we're going to be looking at for this week is Black AF, Widows and Orphans #1 by Kwanzaa Afeyeyo and Tim Smith. Okay, let's talk about this for a moment.
Yes.
We were discussing before we decided to turn on the mic, is it Tim Smith 3 or Tim Smith the third? He writes his name Smith 3, the number 3, not the Roman numeral, the Arabic number 3, not the Roman numeral 3. Right.
So
if it were the Roman numeral 3, it would be Tim Smith III. But is this something kind of like an E.E. Cummings affectation?
Right. Could be. Could be. I've heard Mr. Smith on a podcast before, and I apologize to you if you're listening out there that I don't remember how you prefer it to be addressed, but I know that he'll go by Smith, so we can go that way.
Yeah, SAFO and Smith, and it comes out from Black Mass Studios, and the release date was last week as we record this, April 25th. This title is notable in that it's the very first Black Mask Studios release we have reviewed on the Comics Alternative.
Yeah. And hopefully not the last.
Yeah. My experience with Black Mask hasn't been extensive at all, definitely. But a few years ago, I read some first issues of one or two of their series. I can't remember which ones, honestly. And I thought, there's too much to read. I'm not going to add this to the pile. And then I just got a sense that maybe Black Mask isn't for me. But I've heard so many people, including you, talk about Black Mask titles. And I wanted to give it a try. Now, this title, Black AF, Widows and Orphans, is also interesting in that, you remember the last episode when we were discussing the latest Resident Alien series?
Yes.
And I was very familiar with Resident Alien, and you weren't.
Right.
Now the roles are reversed.
That's right.
You're familiar with Black. I am completely ignorant. This is the very first Black that I have ever read. Although I have put on order the first, I guess, collection of Black. So I want to read that.
Yeah.
So tell me and educate listeners who may not be familiar about the Black Mask series Black.
Sure, absolutely.
Because that can get confusing. Black Mask, Black. What
totally. Yeah. It's totally confusing. And, maybe part of the reason why that confusion wasn't avoided is that the series Black, which was a 6-issue miniseries, that has been collected by Black Mask, initially started as a Kickstarter, by this creative team, specifically Osayefo and Smith. It was a 6-issue, black and white comic. And, after it launched a really successful Kickstarter campaign, Black Mask picked it up and wanted to publish and distribute it. And so that's how we got the Black Mask edition. I'm holding right now the trade of the original Black 6-issue miniseries, and mine is the Kickstarter edition because I was a Kickstarter supporter pretty early on. And I heard about it because I heard Osayefo and Smith on a podcast, as I mentioned, but also more well-known, and sorry, I don't know if that's fair to say, but more sort of longer established creators Jamal Igle and Kerry Randolph were also involved in the project. And so I was really kind of interested in the story, particularly the pitch. And the pitch of Black, which will make sense of its title, is the idea that it's a world where people have superpowers, but the people who have superpowers are people of African descent, are Black people. And there's a phenomenon that happens in our culture, still living with the presence and legacy of white supremacy, and anti-Blackness, that, Black people are treated as a kind of, magical and sometimes like in a negative way, superpowered people who need to be somehow contained. And that's of course a very common superhero trope, thinking about X-Men or thinking about a million superhero storylines that have been about sort of the regulars of society feeling like these somehow, empowered people need to be, contained, policed, somehow, kept under wraps in some way. And so the story really begins with, a young Black man who is, in an all too familiar,
you're talking about the main series.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
That's right. Just to be clear, the original series, which you can get in trade, now, a young man who's shot, by police in the back, but who actually, gets up and walks away, and because he's superpowered. And so that the original series sort of introduces that whole premise and setup and universe. And since then, there's been one, I think it was an 80-issue spinoff, and the AF designation is there's a main Black series, and then Black AF represents the various spin-offs. There was one that came out last November called Black AF America's Sweetheart. That was an 80-page one shot. And now we have Black AF Widows and Orphans #1, which is a spin-off series about one of the characters from this universe.
And do we know how many issues will be in this Widows and Orphans miniseries?
That's a good question. I think it's 6. I think I read somewhere that it's 6. It definitely goes beyond 4 because I think that's where it's solicited at right now. Yeah, I'm guessing around the same length.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So Okay, you come to this world knowing something about Black, as a title, the premise and the narrative universe that they've laid out. Right. I was completely ignorant, and so I was curious in preparing for this week's episode. What would my experience be? Would I be completely lost? And I'll have to tell you, I wasn't. I mean, there are parts about it that I did notice. Yeah, this probably has something to do with the main series, or maybe even the previous AF title. What was it called? Sure. You say?
America's Sweetheart.
America's Sweetheart. Yeah. And I said, but I'll just go with it. So in some ways, my experience reading Black AF, Widows and Orphans #1 is. I guess a little similar to reading Terminal Lance Ultimate Omnibus in that I was outside of this world, or in this case, this narrative world, not really knowing where I was going, but nonetheless strapping in and ready for the ride.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear that it wasn't totally disorienting. I have to admit that I was a little disoriented reading this first issue of Widows and Orphans because we're sort of transported. It's a very different kind of setting. Not very different, but it's a different kind of setting. I've gotten used to that because Black AF, America's Sweetheart, sort of transplants us from the original series, which was happening in cities, to a much more sort of like Montana kind of setting. Widows and Orphans, it sort of brings us to a whole different world that involves ninjas raising young Black children. And I should mention that this is a little bit of background about the world, that since it's African descent children who have these superpowers, they wind up getting kidnapped, trafficked, things like that, nefarious organizations trying to take advantage of them. And so we're sort of transported to a different world with Anansi, our hero, and all that's going on in this issue. And I was a little bit like, well, what's going on? A little bit of playing catch up myself, thinking that I was familiar with this world.
Well, that's interesting that you say that, because maybe when I just said I didn't feel as lost as I thought I would be, is because I expected to be lost. And so my expectations were more or less met, right? There's a lot that went on here that I didn't understand, but I just assumed that it had something to do with other Black titles, titles within this universe. Whereas you, being familiar with this universe, you were nonetheless lost in places. Now, that's curious. Now, I tell you, where things went a little crazy for me, and I got lost. And this is around, and we don't have page numbers, but on the PDF that you and I are reading, this is around page 20 or 21. And this is when this gigantic, is he a ninja as well?
Yes. Yeah.
This big whatever, I don't even know if we're given his name, is where he enters and all hell breaks loose. Basically, this is the biggest fight scene in the book. This is where everything action-wise leads up to. Right. And I was confused about the transition from when, where Nancy and her assistant Hoodrat, when they're entering this space, and then all of a sudden this fight takes place. There seemed to be no transition, no easing in, even momentarily into this. Right. And so that's where I was confused. I even thought, well, maybe I'm missing a page, a digital page. Right.
Yeah. No, I gotta say, I enjoyed the series. I'm obviously still aboard as a supporter, and I like reading it. And the premise is awesome. I think a lot of the art is interesting. The character designs are basically as cool as this kind of stuff is, if you're into this kind of stuff. Obviously, I'm most around for the socio-political, layers, the valences of this kind of work. Sometimes, as I'm reading this work by Osayefo and Smith, I'm disoriented by the storytelling. And I don't know if this is just a stylistic or preference thing. Sometimes I feel like it's a visual communication thing, and maybe this is, I don't want to act like I know more than these folks, but sometimes there's just panel sequences, for instance, that read in a really confusing way. I mean, just one example, there's a sequence in this strip, I'm sorry, in this book where, is it in this book? Maybe it's in the other original series, but somebody's being unmasked, and just the order of things makes it so it's really super confusing who I'm looking at. And so those are sort of just like rudimentary storytelling things. And I'm not saying that there's a lack in here, but it's just a disconnect for me. And so that I tend to have to read things multiple times to sort of grab onto what's going on. So just like you, I think we're being thrown into a very conspiratorial and sort of like wide network of ninja characters, and going after really the superpowered Black community that is protecting itself and one another. And so it is disorienting. But I don't know how much of that to chalk up to the storytelling things I was talking about, and how much to chalk up to just being not familiar yet with all of the factors in this world.
Right. And what we have in this first issue, you mentioned the Black characters with superpowers being trafficked. I mean, this is basically what we have going on, at least laid out in this first issue, right, where we have Anansi and Hoodrat they're taking a journey. They're trying to find, an answer to a mystery that presents itself in the opening pages.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And, Anansi is a character that, first of all, as I said, the design is incredible. There's a legacy with Anansi, I believe, comes from, I'm not sure if it's a religious or, mythological sort of, background, but, I think that character, the character has a cultural legacy as well, I think, and also just looks really cool. And so as a hero, I mean, I think she's one I'm interested in seeing the backstory of. And, there's going to be folks for whom this kind of ninja world that's being brought into this is also a source of, intrigue, attraction for this series. Not something that was in the other, Black work in the past. That's
interesting because, I have to admit, I'm not a big ninja guy. A lot of people are fascinated by ninjas. I never have been.
Right.
It's just something about me.
Totally. Yeah.
So, and plus, the kind of comics I read usually don't have this much action.
Right.
And sometimes the action can be quite disorienting. You were talking about some of the, I don't want to say missed beats, but some of the issues with visual storytelling and some of the potential confusions that may come up. I think some of that in this first issue comes up through the action scenes. Right. Especially, the fight, big fight scene that takes place during the last third of this first issue.
Yeah. Just trying to follow what the heck is happening and who's punching whom and why.
Yeah. Right. And, even in the movies that I watch, I don't like big fight scenes and explosions and stuff like that.
Sure. Yeah. Me too.
But I'm glad that we chose to discuss this week because I wanted to see what it was like for me to be, to read the first issue of a narrative world that I had no clue about. I knew nothing of. And so I'm glad that I got to read this before my first trade collection of Black came through the mail.
Yeah. And I think if what we've said makes folks curious, it's worth a shot. Not everybody, particularly among our listeners, is going to like stuff that's action and superhero fare and all that kind of stuff. And I am, folks know that I do read that stuff, but a lot of times that stuff bores me. What doesn't bore me is when I can sense that there is a relevance to it and using those kinds of tropes to think about and say something about our society. And so this series, I think is really trying to do that and really trying to use the superhero pieces to put together a different kind of puzzle about the world. And I enjoy that.
Yes. Paul, 3 very interesting titles that we looked at this week. We started off with Maximilian Uriarte's Terminal Lance Ultimate Omnibus. After that, we looked at the first issue of Rick Remender and Bengal's Death or Glory. And then we wrapped up with Black AF, Widows and Orphans by Kwanzaa Ofyefo and Tim Smith.
Yeah, it was fun. And I like that you said at the beginning of this that we're looking at 3 really different titles. I think that's something that's been a fun thing to do with you on this podcast, because as we were mentioning at the top of the show, if you look at now the list out there and the Eisner nominations, it's just, it used to be that we were mostly dealing with some superhero stuff, maybe a few underground indie things, something in the, Chris Ware world. I just think that we're now seeing just a wide spectrum of comics that are out there. And I think it's a tall task, but something we try to do here to really read from that wide spectrum. And I think today was fun because we got to dip into different, parts of that spectrum.
We're all about the wide spectrum.
That's right. That's what we do here.
And if you're interested in wide spectrums, then you could probably get your satisfaction met by going to the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service.
Nice segue.
Thank you. Thank you, my friend. Go to dcbservice.com, and there you're going to find a ton of discounts every single month. May is no exception. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this week's episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
You can also email us. Email is a good way to get in touch with us as well. 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Paul at comicsalternative.com, and Derek is Derek at comicsalternative.com.
That's right. You can also find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, Slack, Discord, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we occasionally post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. A lot of ways for people to get in touch with us.
Please do. We love hearing from you.
That's right, yeah. So get in touch and let us know your thoughts. Until next time, I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul. Keep it rockin'.
Hey, what happened?